Hey there, welcome to the walkthrough video for Worship Essentials Plus for Ableton. We're really excited to have Worship Essentials Plus available for Ableton users. I'm Aaron and I'm going to show you the ins and outs of how it works. Worship Essentials Plus requires Ableton Live 9.7.5 or newer in either the standard or suite editions. You'll also need a few third-party plugins. You'll need Omnisphere 2 from Spectrasonics, the Giant and Scarby Mark I libraries from Native Instruments, and Valhalla Shimmer from Valhalla DSP. In addition to your primary keyboard controller, you'll need a Korg Nano Control 2 MIDI controller for controlling Worship Essentials Plus. It comes pre-mapped for all the buttons and faders on the Korg Nano Control 2. Here's what's included in your download. After you extract the zip file included with your purchase, you'll see 4 Ableton Live sets. The 2 labeled 9 are for Ableton Live version 9, and the 2 labeled 10 are for Ableton Live version 10. During development, we discovered there are differences in the contact instruments for Scarby Mark I standalone and the version included with Vintage Keys or Contact. If you have Scarby Mark I as part of Vintage Keys or Contact, use the live sets tagged VK, otherwise use the standard live set. And then you'll find a user's guide and a resources folder with the template for your Korg Nano Control 2, but more on that in just a little bit. Before we start playing, let's confirm a few things in the Ableton Preferences. First, on the Audio tab, make sure the correct audio output device is selected. You can select the built-in headphone output, or if you have an audio interface, select it here. We strongly recommend using an audio interface because it's designed to send a professional +4 dBu line level signal, and you might want to split your sounds across multiple outputs so they can be mixed individually. Your sound engineer might just love you for that. You'll also want to double check that the sample rate and buffer size are set appropriate for your processor. Generally, the sample rate is going to be at 44.1 or 48 kilohertz. And the buffer size you're going to want to set just at the point where you're not causing your CPU to overload. On my computer, I can usually bounce between 128, 256, or 512. But since Worship Essentials Plus for Ableton can be fairly complicated when you have multiple sounds activated, I found 512 is a safe number for me. Generally, you'll also want to look at the output latency or the overall latency time. I've found from personal experience, if it goes much over 12 or 13 milliseconds, it's noticeable, but as long as it's below 12 milliseconds, you'll be fine. Next, let's take a look at the MIDI page. You'll want to confirm that your connected MIDI controller has track enabled. Here I have my keyboard controller connected to the MIDI input on my audio interface. You may want to make sure that remote is turned off so that we're only receiving note data from the primary controller. Next, on the Nano Control 2, you'll want to make sure that remote is turned on, and let's go ahead and turn track off if you have that turned on. You'll see why in just a little bit. Let's take a quick look at the graphic in the user guide. One graphic shows the default MIDI CC assignments for the Korg Nano Control 2, and the second graphic shows the function or feature it controls in Worship Essentials Plus. We've decided to use the Korg Nano Control 2 because they're super popular, readily available, and most people already have one. Worship Essentials Plus was mapped using the factory default MIDI CC assignments, but we've changed the default button behavior. You'll want to change all the button functions to toggle behavior instead of momentary behavior. To do that, you'll need to load the Korg Control Editor software and load the configuration from your Korg Nano Control 2. If you know what you're doing here, you can select each of the buttons, just like this, and change the button behavior to toggle. By default, they're momentary. Or you can load the configuration file that's included with your download. Let's do that now. Go to File, Open, and browse out to where you saved your download. Open the Resources folder and load the configuration file. This loads in all the behaviors that were changed away from factory defaults. The reason we had to turn off track in the Ableton Preferences is that MIDI CC64 is the control used for sustain. So anytime you press this button on the Korg Nano Control 2, it would transmit MIDI CC64 and interfere with the main pedal commands coming from your primary controller. That's why you probably don't want remote enabled for your primary controller or track enabled for your nano control. For the remainder of this walkthrough, I'm going to assume that you have a basic understanding of Ableton, MIDI routing, audio routing, MIDI mapping, clips, and scenes. Nothing is super complicated, but I'll only have time to explain how all these items work together to create the Worship Essentials Plus experience. I don't have time to explain each item in detail, so feel free to brush up on those topics with other online resources if you need a refresher. In Worship Essentials Plus, all audio and MIDI flows left to right. Our very first track is a global MIDI in track. It's set to receive MIDI from all inputs, and MIDI monitor is set to in, so that MIDI is always flowing into this track. All the other instrument tracks are set to receive MIDI from that first track. This means that if you need to change the controller that you're using or make any changes to the MIDI inputs, the only place you need to change it is in this first global MIDI in track. The only other place you would need to change a MIDI routing is on the drone track, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's the only other channel that's set to receive MIDI from the outside world. It's also set to receive from all inputs, and MIDI monitor is set to in. By having these separated, once we talk about the drone in a bit, you'll see why you might want to play the drone with a secondary keyboard. All audio in Worship Essentials Plus also flows from left to right. All the audio generated by the instrument channels flows from left into their respective subgroups if they have one, like piano and pad. And then they flow into 4 other primary output groups here. The 4 primary output groups are then routed to the Ableton master channel, controlled by the master fader on the Korg Nano Control 2. Now, the reason we have 4 output groups here is that you might want to split your sounds and send them through multiple outputs through your audio interface. If that's the case, then change the Audio 2 routing here to send directly to one of your physical outputs on your audio interface. This will let you separate the sound that you're sending to your front of house, and it might just let your audio engineer mix your sounds separately and achieve a better balance in the mix. If you need to do that, this is where you do it. But for most cases, you may just leave it set to master and then route all of your sounds to the master output, which is then routed to the correct output pair here under the master output selection. Of course, all built-in Ableton metronomes are controlled with the Q output, so if you are using click or anything like that, you want to make sure you select the correct Q output so you're not sending click and sounds together to the front of house. All of the numbered instrument tracks are labeled 1 through 6, and those correspond with faders 1 through 6 on the Korg Nano Control. Fader number 7 is assigned to the drone pad, and fader number 8 is assigned to Ableton's master output. Again, if you change your output routings by splitting out your sounds so they're not routed through the master output, then you won't be able to use this master output, just to give you a heads up. Our first fader in sound bank contains our primary piano sounds. Our second fader in sound bank contains our electric piano, except for a few aggressive pads on a few specific patches. Our third fader in sound bank contains all of our primary pad sounds, and our fourth fader in sound bank primarily contains a synth bass, except for one patch where it contains a high strings with a low strings on fader number 5. Normally, fader number 5 contains all of our pulses, and fader number 6 contains all of our arpeggiated synth sounds or individual synth sounds. Again, fader number 7 controls our master drone pad, and then again, fader number 8 is our master if you're routing audio to the master. On the Korg Nano Control 2, when the faders are all the way down, the plugins are bypassed and will not produce any sound. This also helps reduce the load on your CPU when your faders are pulled down and you don't need to be producing sound. Bump the fader slightly off of 0 to activate the plugin and begin producing sound. The track buttons let you navigate down or up a scene, and the cycle button right below it lets you launch the selected scene. The record button with the dot is used for tap tempo in case you need to adjust the tempo of an ARP or delay on the fly. The play button toggles our drone pad, but we'll talk about that later. The rest are unused unless you want to map them to something in the future. Let's listen to our main piano. All right, so that forms the base of our piano sounds, and we have a lot we can do with it. Our first button engages a high octave, which is useful for playing lead lines. And our second button engages a high EQ shelf just for a little high-end boost so your piano cuts through a mix better. And then over here on the right, we have a button that engages a compressor and a knob that controls the amount of compression so you can dial in a super punchy lead piano. Add to that a reverb with a variable amount of send, and you can get a super interesting lead. Here we have a quarter note delay with a variable amount of delay. And a dotted eighth delay. All right, and then finally, our bottom button engages a velocity limiter for a super soft, warm piano. And then overall, knob number 1 is a master piano filter. Regardless of what's playing through the piano channel, you can always filter the tone down to get exactly where you want it. Here's our electric piano. With a little extra drive. A little tremolo. And finally, a little chorus. And of course, you can also send it through the reverb with the same buttons as the real piano. Quarter note delay. Dotted eighth. Even the compressor again. Let's bring up fader number 3 and look at our pads. Here's our default pad. Our first button adds a bit of extra modulation to the decayed tail. Our second button adds a high EQ shelf for a little extra breath on top. And our third button activates a low-cut filter to reduce a little bit of the low end. This is helpful if you need to quickly pull out some low end to work with your sound system. The pad responds to the mod wheel and brightens as you raise it. And with this button, we can turn on a pad reverb that's adjustable with the third knob. As you bring up the reverb mix, you'll notice the pad starts sitting further in the back of the mix. You can really shape the depth of the pad this way. And here we can turn on a shimmer. The shimmer is adjustable with the fourth knob as well. We have a variation on the pad called Cathedral Atmosphere. And here's our bass. The bass is only on the lower part of the keyboard up until D2. It works great to layer underneath the piano to thicken it up. Or a pad. Our first button opens up a filter for a much grittier sound. Our second button turns on a sidechain. And you can have that filter open or closed for that sidechain. All right, and our third button turns on an arpeggiator. But you can engage all three or any combination thereof. Here we have all three. Now on our string patch, fader number 4 contains our high strings. Fader number 5 has a low octave. We have a little reverb. A little shimmer. And together, they let you play very sweeping string parts with just a few notes. Fader number 5 has our pulse sounds. You can play stabby chords by yourself, or you can turn on the arpeggiator with the lower button. Add a bit of reverb. And the dotted eighth delay. And it does respond to the mod wheel. Now in a few other patches, we have some other types of pulses as well. Even a dulcimer that layers on top of other sounds for a really cool texture. Fader 6 has a few other synth sounds as well. Or you can turn on the arpeggiator for that as well. Just like the other pulse sounds, it also responds to reverb and the dotted eighth delay. And again, we have several different types of arpeggiated synths here. And together, all of those can let you create a soundscape like this. Fader 7 is our drone pad. The play button activates our drone pad while it's held down and temporarily blocks your keyboard from playing anything else. To play the drone pad, hold down the drone button while you play anything else on the keyboard. Keep the notes depressed and release the drone button to latch the notes so they continue playing. At this point, you're free to play anything else. The drone will continue to play until you press the button once more to release the notes. Now let's talk a little bit about navigating around the live set. I've just given you a few demos of some of the sounds in the sound banks, and if you look at the top here, in each of the sound banks, the clips beneath it represent all the possible sounds inside that sound bank. So all of the patches for Worship Essentials Plus are just a collection of these clips that control the sounds within each of the sound banks. To navigate, you can either select a scene with your mouse and click on the play button, or you can use the coordinator control and use the track up and down buttons to navigate up or down, and then launch the scene using the cycle button. Using Ableton, you have to select the scene first and then launch it so that the clips take effect and change the sound. Now there's one setting in Ableton you might want to double check, so let's go there now. In the Ableton Preferences, under Record, Warp, and Launch, if you enable Select Next Scene on Launch, as I have done here, then you can just use the Launch button to launch straight through all of the patches consecutively. Now this comes in helpful if you're trying to build a set and you want to use patches in a certain order. What you can do is duplicate some scenes at the bottom here, right-click and duplicate, or Command-D if you're on a Mac, Control-D on a PC. So let's create a few empty scenes down there, and then we'll take a few of these and we will copy them by holding down Option or Alt on the Mac and just dragging them down to an empty area. You'll see it creates a copy of that patch. If we just take a few of them and copy them down here, now we have a copy of them in a separate area, and then we can use that feature where we just cycle straight through in the order that we want them. You can also use this technique to build your own patches with certain clips that you like. Let's say you want to take the Frozen piano. You can copy that clip down to its own scene. Then let's take the worship pads along with the bass, and let's say we want the super saw pulse, and then the polytrance arp. Then you can rename the scene to give it a name. And if you want to set a tempo for the patch, just notate the tempo in Ableton format where it's the BPM followed by BPM, 71 BPM. And if you want to change the meter as well, let's say to 6/8, just type that in as well. And you've just created your own patch with your own collection of sounds with your own tempo and meter. If you make any significant changes to the live set, be sure to save your changes so you don't lose it when you close it. But we recommend before making any major changes, make sure you save a copy of that live set or keep a copy of your downloaded file just in case you ever need to revert Worship Essentials Plus back to its default. If you need any help at all, be sure to find us at www.thatworshipsound.com and click on support, and we'd be more than happy to help.